There are more satellite images that are taken today than ever before. We have governmental programs that have 50-year-long archives of images from around the world, and companies with hundreds of millions in funding dedicated entirely to taking images of the world every day. But how do we go from the image to any actual impact? So today, for the 50th episode of Minds Behind Maps, I wanted to take a step back. Today's guest is Aravind Ravichandran, the founder of TerraWatch Space. Aravind provides a unique perspective on what is going on in the Earth observation industry through his newsletter and podcast. If there's someone who's keeping up with the most of what is going on in the commercial side of satellite imagery, it's Aravind. So for his second time on the podcast, we'll take a look at the 5 layers of Earth observation, taking us from images to all the steps in the middle required to actually lead to change. Before that, this episode is sponsored by SkyFi. I talk a lot about satellite imagery on this podcast and how many people use them for all sorts of applications. Though one of the biggest challenges surrounding these satellite images is still just getting your hands on them. It's so far usually been a hassle of prices not being upfront or having to get on a sales call before buying any images. SkyFi wants to change that. They're partnering with many of the imagery providers to make it as easy as possible for anyone to just use their credit card and buy imagery, either tasking a new area or ordering from a catalog of existing data. This is what buying satellite imagery should always really have been like: clear and upfront pricing and availability. If you want to easily buy satellite imagery, SkyFi is quickly becoming the place to go. So head over to skyfi.com. They've also recently announced the support for free and open data on their platform. Specifically, they're starting with Sentinel-2, so if you want to get some free images or pay for some higher resolution ones, SkyFi is the place to go. I'm sure you know I like starting these conversations asking people how they describe themselves, but I've actually had you on before, so I'll just point people to that.
Oh, that's true.
Instead, I want to dive right in, and I'd like you to try to describe to me, as if I knew nothing, what Earth observation is.
Well, I think the way I would describe that to people is essentially, monitoring the planet and sensing what we have on land, the oceans, and the atmosphere. So we're using satellites to essentially get data about the atmosphere, the oceans, and the land, so that we can understand what's going on in the planet and our activities on the planet and the relationship between the two. So, the first part of that, you can call that science, where you're trying to learn a lot more about the planet. And the second part of that is a lot more commercial and economic, because you're trying to monitor our activities on the planet, whether it is our flights, our ships, our constructions, what's happening on the ground, whether it's war or, floods, something that's impacting our lives, so activities. So that's the second part. And then the third part for me is a lot more interesting, is where, nature meets man-made objects and everything that we have created, which is kind of what we have started to see a lot these days. So the relationship between the two. So essentially, that's how I'll start on a fundamental level, without really going into technology or anything. And you saw, I just pointed to satellites. Obviously, there's more to more than that's just satellites. But I think that kind of, I guess, gives people a good high-level understanding.
Why, and I'm going to play devil's advocate, why do we need satellites to do that? You talked about science, about the commercial aspects, and then understanding, the impact of humanity on the ground, on Earth, on nature. Why do you need satellites to do that?
Essentially because of the vantage point, and it's not disturbed by anything. It can be disturbed by something that is also artificial, that's called space debris, but then essentially it's not going to be disturbed. So, it's not under the constraints of the Earth. So it's not about weather. We can talk about different sensors. It can work in different weather conditions. It can work a larger scale, meaning you are not constrained to, launching something to just see the ground below the area. So it's not a drone, it's not an aircraft, and you don't have to spend a lot of time flying the aircraft around different parts of the world if you want to monitor different parts of the world, because the satellite is flying up at 7.5 kilometer per second. So it can, spin around the Earth. So coverage is an important part. And one of the most underappreciated parts is the time. You can do that continuously over a period of time, all the time, because satellites are up there and they've been up there for 55 years now. And meaning we have data that can go back. Essentially, I think that's how I kind of also justify when people ask, like, why satellites? It's essentially the scale, the coverage, and the time aspect, the temporal aspect.
And so again, let me push back a little bit, because I think it's interesting to try to understand that a little bit broader. And I'm curious how you explain it, because you could take the argument that, I don't know, weather is something that you've worked on, for example. So let's go there. There are weather stations, and we can know very precisely the temperature, the humidity, how much rain there was. And once the station is there, you need to maintain it a little bit, but you can have a record over time as well.
Mm-hmm.
So why not do that?
Yeah, we can do that. It's just that we need that at a scale of the Earth. And Earth, I mean, it does not have a lot of land. I forgot the actual numbers, but not a lot of 70% of the Earth, if I'm not mistaken, is water. Correct? I think I need to check that, but essentially we don't have a lot of land, so you can only install so many weather stations. So let's assume that we have spent all the money and we have found a way to scale weather stations, which we have, to be honest. A lot of the Western countries do have a good coverage of weather stations, going with the same example, but you can't install them on the oceans. For the oceans, you have another kind of version of weather stations. Now you have weather buoys, where you can put the sensors on weather buoys and let it float. But again, it's a lot of oceans, and then there are a lot of places that we cannot reach to go and install them. So I think the argument for satellites, especially concerning weather, becomes just more interesting, because for weather is defined. I think you've had someone who worked on the weather book, The Weather Machine, on the podcast, right?
Yeah, Andrew Bloom. Mm-hmm.
And if you read the book, you can understand that there's a lot of, I guess, factors influencing weather, and atmosphere is a big part of it. And you need to try and understand the atmosphere to predict the weather. And if you don't understand the atmosphere in its entirety in 3D, you can't predict the weather, or we would have not been able to have the improvement that we had until now. Because the improvements, if you see the correlation between when satellite-based observations started coming in and the improvement in weather forecasts, I guess you can see that the satellites have made a remarkable improvement. Like, why satellites made such a big difference, or is satellites really that important, especially for weather? I think it has been validated. For imagery, I think we are on the course of, I guess, working on it. We've started to include that, for looking at different use cases. I'm sure we'll probably talk about different commercial use cases. But for weather, I think why satellites is quite validated.
Let's assume, okay, I'm on board. Satellites make a lot of sense. And again, I'm playing very high level, kind of walking people through what that would look like. How do you go from my satellites took images, and then what? Like, how does that change anything?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in some cases, the image is good enough because you can just see the image. I mean, people have used that in for battlefield and military operations, where they just have an image and that's enough. So sometimes just taking that image that you took from space without really flying an aircraft, or in these days flying a drone, it's probably good enough. So sometimes the imagery just does enough things, or serves the purpose, let's say, for that specific time frame. But in most cases, you need to try and process the data in a way that it is converted into something that is useful, because unusable, I think, the two important things. Useful, you can make a case for it, like I just made a case for weather data, right? Like, it's definitely useful. Without this data, you cannot predict the weather. 80% to 90% of weather forecasts include, the forecasts include 80 to 90% of data that comes from satellites. That's what all facts. But then that is just justifying the usefulness aspect. But then we need to make it usable. meaning if you just give someone an image, it's more likely not going to be useful. Someone on the battlefield, he knows exactly what he's looking for, so he can use it. But then a lot of people in the world and a lot of applications of Earth observation cannot just use it, meaning the imagery that we take from satellite is not usable at all. So we need to work towards making it usable. And that's when, I guess, you start creating the value chain of actors, whether it is folks who are just doing the processing, meaning correcting the imagery, correcting for noise, correcting what the atmosphere did to the imagery. That's called pre-processing. And then you have the processing aspect where, you actually try to make sense of it, whether it is either applying an algorithm or just having a human, mark the spots where there are trees or mark the spots where there are ships or whatever the use case is, and then try and maybe count them. Maybe that's the usability of that, right? Like maybe now you've taken the image and then now you've said, okay, in these areas there are, I don't know, 20% of that area is covered with trees, and I validated it with my eye. And now that information is usable. I don't know for what, but then at least that becomes somewhat usable. We are still figuring out, that's a phase where we are in Earth observation, where I think as an industry, where we have tried to find applications from the imagery, but now we are figuring out, okay, we figured out 20% of this area is covered with trees, or 20% of that is covered with 3 species of trees. And now we are trying to figure out, okay, what can we do with that information, right? Just because the data is usable doesn't mean that things have become actionable or actions have been taken. But that's a different conversation. But at least from a value chain point of view, you go through, at least in the way TerraWatch segments, there's 5 segments, from data to platform to analytics to insights to applications. But that's kind of the technical version. But I just gave you the informal version.
That's actually where I wanted to go next, is if you had to do this in a few minutes, breaking down those 5 layers, again, not necessarily within a lot of details, but maybe just give an example of each of those as well. So try to break that down. What does that look like? What are these? Because there's companies at every level of those, maybe an example of each company, and what is the value that each of those company does for maybe the one above.
Starting from the data, which is kind of the fundamental point, you can make an argument that in order to keep the data layer alive, so data layer is essentially where data is collected through satellites, at least in the way that we are talking about here.
So we're talking about images,
data of the atmosphere, of the atmosphere, and if you want to extend it further into the geospatial sector, any type of data that is geospatial. And if you want to extend it even further, then it includes any type of data, statistics data about what is the population of a town. That is also data layer. But then for the purpose of, just simplifying things, because we're talking about Earth observation from a satellite-based perspective, I just stick to the definition of data that is created from satellites. So that's the data layer. So, planet, any companies that people have heard of in Earth observation are probably going to be more likely in the data layer, just because that's where a lot of the cool stuff happens about sending satellites up and taking the images. So whether it's Planet or Maxa or Umbra or ISI, any of the names. But yes, there's companies in the data layer that are focused on generating the data. So that is their goal. There's a lot of things that happen in the background, which kind of goes into the space industry / remote sensing, that part, which is lying in the background of data that doesn't get a lot of attention, but, sometimes people don't care, right? On the second layer, I put together, it doesn't really reflect the value of data, but I think it's an important component, is what I call the platform layer. So platforms are essentially where the data is stored. In some cases, you can have a company having their own platform. So Planet can have their own platform. But then there are also kind of, let's say, third-party independent platforms which curate different types of data for the purpose of this conversation, satellite data, right? So there's probably a company like SkyFi whose only purpose is to curate and aggregate data from different sources, from different providers, and they allow access to that data. So platform companies usually at least do the job of accessibility, but then platforms can do more. because platforms can not just allow you to access the data, but then they can also allow you to work with the data, to process the data, right? So accessibility is just one thing, but then the processing aspect is also becoming more and more important, because you need to, let's say you want to use 2 or 3 types of source of data to combine it and create whatever you want to create. Platform layer allows you to do that. And as we know in Earth observation, more than one source is usually required to solve a problem. Let's say, for the sake of an argument, you need to combine Planet with Sentinel, because Sentinel is an open data program of the Copernicus program. So the data is open, and you probably want to combine that with Planet. So platform layer becomes very interesting there, right? So that's the platform layer. A lot of kind of, I guess, things going on in the background again. Where is the data stored? The cloud comes in, because satellite data is very heavy. So you cannot think about just opening the platform on your computer desktop application and using it. Won't work. So you need to kind of have, and geospatial is getting a lot more cloud native, just because of the complexity of the data and how hard it is to store and process it. So there's things going on the infrastructure side.
Do you see it like a sort of a supermarket that just sells a lot of things off the shelf? So you have something like Planet would be your company who makes a specific product, and then I don't know, iSci makes another one, and then SkyFi comes in as more like a supermarket where you go in and everything is on the shelf and you can take it. Sometimes they sell you a premix, things like that. Is that kind of how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, well, I think a few years ago, I used to think of that, or kind of, the analog is to the video streaming companies of the world.
Okay.
They kind of aggregate. I think Amazon Prime Video has become that today, where they have their own data, or sorry, they have their own exclusive content, let's say. But they also have, like, what, if you want to watch this, we can also give access to this channel. You can pay extra per month, and you can watch this channel. It has become that. The only difference being Prime Video has its own content, but that is not happening in satellite imagery yet, where SkyFi does not have their own satellites and brings their own data set. But it can happen, because there are some platforms that are coming in from Earth observation companies where there's a potential for that to happen. Planet just acquired Sentinel Hub. I know you had Sentinel Hub on the podcast, so Sentinel Hub is already a platform. So in the future, in one parallel universe, you can have this platform that Planet will have through Sentinel Hub, which will have Planet data, but maybe it might have data from other providers as well, because today Sentinel Hub has data from other providers. So in a parallel world, this analogy can work. I don't know if that's going to happen. We'll see in the future. So essentially, platform allows us to mix and match, and sometimes it's very, I guess, just based on availability. It's like, okay, we have 20 satellite providers today, let's try and bring all of them into one place. But then it can also be very contextual, right? Like there can be a platform that is only focused on hydrological data and climate data, and that's the only focus of the platform, meaning it has a thesis behind it. They just won't include any data set, right? Like there are, again, a lot of platforms from EUMETSAT, for instance, or NOAA, and they're all obviously very weather and climate focused. Will they give you access to, I don't know, planet imagery? Maybe not, because that's not the focus of planet imagery, right? But in the future, they may also come in. But just to note that some platforms can be also, let's say, problem driven or some sort of thesis driven, or if you want to call it vertical driven, it can be focused on a specific vertical, and that's also possible.
If I take your streaming example, it would be, let's go with, you said Amazon Prime. So Amazon Prime, they're the platform and they have partnerships with the movie production studios. So I don't know, someone like Warner Bros. Or Universal or things like that that make the movies. Then they partner with the platform. We talked about SkyFi for the imagery, and then that's Amazon Prime, Netflix, things like that. You're saying there's also other platforms that are more topical. So it would be, I'm sure this exists. I'm not aware of any, but like a platform that does only thrillers, for example, things like that, or like just crime movies. And what you're saying is they could venture out where instead of having just movies, which in our analogy is the satellite images, you could start having short films or maybe novellas or things like that, because it's around that topic of crime. And so you find people who have this interest And then you can start branching out to different mediums, basically.
100%, yeah, and a lot of those already exist, right? Like at least in, let's say, in the video streaming world, there is platforms for. I think now it's geographical content has become very popular, right? Like so in India, I
Right.
know that we had just a streaming platform for India. I know that it exists in Africa as well. There is a streaming platform for Africa, which is actually being very successful, and their only goal is to just curate only African
Right.
originated content. So at the end of the day, topical, as you said, that's kind of the goal, and that exists in Earth observation as well. It's just been very, let's say, scientific so far. There's not been much commercial efforts there, but or at least one of my theses of the many theses I have in EO is we will need to have a lot more topical thematic platforms in Earth observation also, just because it allows you to dig deeper, right? Like if you're a horizontal satellite imagery marketplace and you have to start offering, I don't know, some type of data that is not useful for everybody, but just for 5 customers, will you really do that? Maybe not. But then having that platform available is going to be great for a specific sector. And I think inevitably we will start having that.
We have the data, we have the platform. You said there are 5. What's the next one?
Oh, yeah. Let's go. Let's continue. Analytics. Yeah. So the third one is analytics. This is essentially converting the data into useful information. It is not an insight. So essentially, the easiest example is object detection, right? So object detection is for me analytics. Like we mentioned before, here are the trees. It's already a complex process, right? Right? Detecting a tree is just not simple. You need to probably combine 2 or 3 types of data. You probably need to do some ground truthing exercises, but then you've now figured out, and land use examples, the land use maps are a very good example of analytics. You have, I don't know, 20% of this is land, 30% is, urban built area, 50% is water bodies. That's great. For me, that's analytics, right? So that's where analytics, or the boundary of analytics, stops. Is it provides information. The information is not contextual. The information is probably not even usable. But then, now we have not just pixels, we have some sort of information that people can start making use of. Analytics, that's why I think most of it tends to be open sourced or openly available in portals. Well, there's also obviously commercial applications there in the analytics layer. But then, more often than not, you will find them to be openly available for use, just because there's also a lot of complexity that goes into how these information is extracted. Again, not going into the technicalities of it, but then you have different ways of deriving what a tree is, what type of tree it is, what a water body looks like, where the water body ends, and things like that. So essentially, analytics kind of ends there, in my opinion. For instance, Global Forest Watch, right? Like Global Forest Watch, you go and look into Global Forest Watch. It gives you an idea of where the forests are in the world, how much the forests are disappearing, which is when it kind of branches out into insights for me, Global Forest Watch. But then if you just look at the Global Forest Watch map and then just see, okay, here are the forests in the world, which is extracted from satellite data combined with other types of data, that's analytics, right? So that's where analytics, the boundary of analytics stops. What's interesting that's happening in analytics that I said before, a couple of things are disrupting it. One is what is called edge computing or on-orbit processing. So now there are companies, not fully commercial yet, they are being demonstrated in space where you have the ability to, I guess, process some algorithms on board the satellite that can just downlink the analytics. So for me, the analytics layer is disrupted. I don't know how much the level of disruption would be, because as you might know, it's not super simple to just put one algorithm in orbit and say, execute the algorithm on this image, and that's going to be very good analytics. For me, analytics is what in the weather equivalent I would call the forecast, right? Like the forecast of what we see in our phones every day, or what we look at before we plan for a picnic. That's analytics. It's probably not actionable, but it's information that is super useful for you.
The analytics being like, this is what the weather is going to be like for the next week. It's going to be sunny on Tuesday, it's going to rain on Wednesday, and then it's going to be sunny for the rest of the day. Like, that's not actionable in the sense that what you want to know is, do I need to take my sunglasses or my umbrella? And that's the actionable thing. It's
Yeah.
like one layer after is, you actually only need an umbrella on Wednesday.
exactly. Yeah. So if you want to kind of, go and talk about insights so that we can kind of see the difference, insights just make the information that was given through analytics a lot more contextual. Again, actionable is a very kind of, I mean, I would say overused word, but we can't really say what is actionable for different industries or for different people. But at least I've started to call that contextual information. So at least we have tried to contextualize it for the use that we're talking about. So going back to Global Forest Watch gives you analytics. Here are the forests in the world. And then when they convert to insights is when they start showing the time series of, or they released a report recently of how much deforestation happened in 2022 or in the world. And then they segmented it by geography. Now they made it, not just, they didn't just give a map that said, here are the number of trees that were cut in 2022. That would have been analytics. But then they went one step further and then tried to contextualize it. Okay, in the last 20 years, this is what happened. This is how many forests or how much forest disappeared. And they try to contextualize it and they made it, contextual. For weather, it is the same case, right? Like you see, I mean, you can argue that the smiley is a little more contextual because people just judge based on you make decisions based on the smiley. It's like, oh, the next 3 days are going to be rainy. I'm not going to go plan for a picnic, right? So maybe it's actionable, maybe it's contextual, but it's not, I think it's not enough. So for me, the better example is when, you see a forecast of the next 2 days are going to be windy for 100 kilometers an hour. And if you're a construction company, what does it really mean for you? Not everybody knows what 100 kilometers per hour means. Can they,
Right.
can they run their crane? Can you work? And if you're an airport, do you need to, let's say they said there's a snowstorm the next 2 days. Does that mean that they need to prepare for de-icing their planes? Can you just tell me what to do instead of saying there's a 70% probability that you will have a snowstorm in the next 2 days with this much temperature? It's good enough, but it's not contextual. In their case, the context is, okay, do I need to set up ground crews to de-ice the planes or not? Because that's what they care about. It's like, you can tell me whatever the percentage probability is, but just tell me if I need to prepare for that, right? So that's their context. For us, the context is, should I need to take my umbrella or sunglasses?
That's a very good example. Like if I'm thinking about as an end user that it's very weird to say end user, like passenger of a plane, and I want to go somewhere. Looking at the forecast doesn't tell me if my plane is going to fly or not. Like, yeah, it's I have to go to the airline company and ask them, is it a yes or a no? Like, I don't understand how the weather is going to affect that.
Mhm.
That's a very good example. I'm definitely going to steal that more.
I think also from an imagery point of view, it's important because as I gave the example of Global Forest Watch, and I think a lot of companies today in Earth observation are trying to be in the insights layer because a lot of them before were trying to do analytics, and I know of several of them who are just detecting trees, detecting buildings, and now, like I said, we had the Google, Microsoft open building data set. So good example of analytics becoming a lot more, I guess, open and openly available. You can talk about the science and the, let's say, the technicality behind the differences between them, but then it's becoming more open. So now inevitably a lot of companies are forced to go into insights because you need to start contextualizing the insight. Generally, the use of Earth observation as an insight can be categorized into three, which is an alert, an API, or a dashboard. But then that is just based on my experience. Usually that's how insights are delivered from Earth observation.
Is that the application layer, the last one that you have?
Yeah, the application layer is essentially almost like, I think people try and start building applications. That is their goal. Because to define application is a product. Is a product. It is not. It is not a custom product. It is not a setup where you can go and run. An application layer is a product where you have a pitch, and the pitch is my product does this, and it only does that, right? Like it's not a setup where you can say, you know what, I can also do that and that and that and that. No.
Do you have an example maybe of what that could look like?
For me, the best examples of application layers are companies that we may not know of because they are insurance companies, they are ag tech companies, they are even weather companies, right? Like, so tomorrow, the company that I was working with before, I would put them in the application layer because they had a product that was focused on providing weather intelligence for people. That was their thing. They did not try to do 10 things. They just started to provide weather alert, and likewise wildfire.
The way I'm thinking about this is if we go back to our airplane
Mhm.
example, if that answer to is my plane delayed is like, if that is only available like inside the terminal, inside the airport on a dashboard somewhere, that's not very useful in a sense,
Mhm.
like, because you have to go all the way to the airport to find the answer to that. So would it be like,
You create an app and ask people to pay $10 a month, and the app is called, I don't know, Air Flight Alert or Flight Weather Alert, and then you pay $10 a month to get subscription to the app, which will give you customized, I don't know, alerts or information for whether your flight is going to run or not. So that's where the insight graduates to application. Yeah, that's a good example.
yeah, I was thinking even like just in, I don't know, if you use whatever airline, like they have their own app and it's just like a pop-up in their
Yep.
application,
Hmm.
like, and that's pretty much all there
Yeah.
is they
Yeah.
work
Sorry, I was
on
thinking more
integrating that.
capitalistically, but yeah, you're right. The airline can give you the app. Yeah.
No, for sure. No, I'm just saying that because I would want my airline to tell me if the flight is canceled. I would not want to pay just to know that.
Yeah, but that's, an
Just,
extra kind of add-on.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
kind of
yeah, for
third
sure.
party,
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Someone
like,
might want that information. Like if you're a hotel
yep.
around that, you might want to know how many flights have been canceled and how many
Hmm.
rooms are we going to have to
Yeah.
take into account.
I mean, to talk about that, there's a company, Flight Radar 24. The
Yes.
company's only value proposition is tracking flights, and that's what they do. They give you information about when the flight arrived, the identification of the flight, and they combine a lot of data sources. And I think they go through the entire value chain, right? Like they detect the flight using AIS, automatic identification system data, and sorry, AIS, ADSB
Hmm.
data, and they also combine that with ground data from ground radars and airports and all that. So they're kind of then trying to making that insight, right? Like they're like, okay, we can now provide the departure time for a flight and the arrival time for a flight, and now then they packaged into a product where you can go and subscribe and say, I want to track information about a flight, of a flight that went down 5 years ago. Their product does that, right? So they're a good example of company in the application layer as well.
The next thing I wanted to talk about is then how you come in into all that equation, and kind of understand a little bit your current work and what TerraWatch is. Maybe staying on that high level, like if you, we on like, we've just gone through pretty much like the entire industry of Earth observation, mostly on the commercial side. So within all of those five segments, what do you do?
Mhm. Good question. Yeah, TerraWatch is not positioned in any of the five segments, which is good because I don't want TerraWatch to be positioned there because I feel like there's enough activity across the five segments. But I think what TerraWatch's goal is to be at least, there are two arms of the business. One is what I call the advisory arm, and then the other one is the insights arm. So the advisory arm is essentially, as the name implies, the consulting work. So essentially consulting and working on strategic projects with companies across the five layers. And there are like two others that kind of sit, one on the top, one on the right. Let's say on the top is kind of the space agencies and investors. So also they need some consulting on where the market's going, where to invest, and things like that. So working with the companies, working with the space agencies and investors, and then also extending, to the far right, the sixth segment that nobody talks about, but that's who give the money and keep the sector running, the end users or the users of Earth observation in general. So working with those companies on how to start adopting Earth observation within their organization, whether it's in banking or insurance or mining or agriculture. So working with them. So essentially, the consulting arm works with the five layers along with the ones on the top who, let's say, fund and manage the operations like space agencies and investors and end users. Obviously, the way I work with each of them is different, but at the end of the day, you can call them all strategic projects because I'm not doing technical consulting. I'm not telling the companies what algorithm to use, but essentially more strategic work on where the go-to-market should be, where the expansion should be, what market to focus on. And with investors, it's more about which, companies look interesting, and if they're looking at investing in a company, due diligence for that company. And with end users, it's a lot more on adoption, just helping them understand where each of the companies are, and maybe they have a problem for a specific use case to help them understand what are their different options, right? Like they can go and buy the data, but then, you can also go use the open source analytics and hire a couple of people and get your work done because you have hired a couple of people in-house. So different ways of pursuing that for different organizations. So working with that. So that's the, let's say, the consulting arm. The second one is more the insights arm, which is where the newsletter and the podcast, which is on hiatus right now, that's where the podcast and the newsletter comes in to provide insights for the industry, for the end users, for everybody, for every stakeholder that I've mentioned until now. That's where the insights arm comes in. There's a third one that is starting to kind of emerge, which was not planned, but it's more of a, I guess, an extension of insights, to put it simply, which is kind of TerraWatch becoming kind of a marketing and a strategic communications firm as well, where working with companies in helping them position themselves in the market, produce content to help communicate what they're doing to the end users. Because I'm working with, I guess, the stakeholders across the industry, I think companies find that valuable as well, to use TerraWatch to not just as, a please feature my case study on the newsletter, which is not work. It doesn't work, but it's more like, can we create a case study together that will, make more end users understand what we do better? Or can we create a white paper where we talk about what our capabilities are, so that when end users read it or when investors read it, they get a better understanding of what they can do. Because, as we know, I think you also have that shared opinion about, there's a lot of, the industry needs a lot of marketing, a lot of thought leadership, a lot of education. So I guess the marketing and the communication side of TerraWatch is, kind of focusing on that. It was not planned, like I said. It was more of a, I guess, built based on inbound. Let's put it that way. It was not consciously planned. But then, it's starting to emerge as one of the things as well. So essentially, to do what I'm doing today, right? Like, there are 5 segments of EO, and end users need to understand that. And if you're a company, you need to understand, where you're positioned, so you can create your marketing material that is, focused on that. So yeah, that's kind of where the 3, I guess, units or functions of TerraWatch are today.
So it's basically what we spend the first half hour of this conversation doing, but a lot deeper and a lot more tailored to whatever company might fit in that global view, and then kind of telling them what they should be paying attention to, what other companies exist out there. Maybe for, like, you're talking about investors, like a thing that happens a lot is due diligence, which is before someone comes up with a great idea and they're trying to pitch to an investor, and the investor wants to know, wait, is this something that already exists? Is there a market for this? Who else is doing that? And they would go to someone like you who has this broader view of the industry to ask those questions.
Exactly. Yeah. That's basically it. And also, company, the Earth observation is also, let's say, maturing. So companies
Right.
are, the investment rounds are reaching more 50 million and 60 million and 70 million and 100 million, right? So for that, there's a lot of diligence required. And also,
Right.
we've started to see acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions as well. So for that, it's a lot more important to understand where the industry is going. As I was saying, right, like the analytics layer is being disrupted a lot. One, by open source, availability of data, and analytics as an open source, and also edge computing. So if you're a company who says that my goal is to build the best algorithm for tree species identification, great. But just that, does it have a market? That's just one example of, things that due diligence requires. And
Right.
also where, I guess, and also I think what my kind of, I guess, value add is not just the understanding and, awareness about what's going on in the market, but then doing so with an independent and objective outlook, I guess, which I guess is important in the world, because I'm not biased by anything. As much as I'd like to have like favorites, and I might secretly have some companies and some, let's say, sensors or even like products as favorites, keeping that aside and providing consulting, especially, I think that's valid for investors, but also for end users, right? Like, so they need to know, like, there should be 5 scenarios for using Earth observation in my company. You can go and buy data from a data provider, but there are other options, and they need to be aware of that, right? So I think it's important that I'm objective to keep the
Yeah.
offering running.
So let's go a little bit onto how you do stay independent.
Mm-hmm.
This is something I like asking often about, is how the money works. So the consulting, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. People come to you, they pay you basically for the knowledge that you have of the industry. But that's one of the two arms. You talked about the other one, which is a lot of sharing online, like your newsletter. We'll put that in the show notes, of course. You mentioned the podcast that you've done for a while. Like that requires a lot of effort, but those things are free. They're put out for free. So how do you rationalize doing that? And this is me asking that as someone who does the podcast and puts it out for free. So there's a bit like, I just am curious to hear how you're thinking about this. I know you started a paid newsletter as well. I'm guessing that's part of it. I'm just curious how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, when I started, I kind of started writing the blogs just to express my thoughts. And at that time, I was already, doing consulting in my previous job at PwC within the space industry. But, when I started putting out the blogs, I realized that, there's some value in putting out the blogs. Let's continue doing it, which is kind of how I continued doing that. And a lot of that has just happened by, I guess, coincidence and just gradually evolving. So, the first thing I'll say is I didn't put a lot of thought into it from the very beginning. I think it's very iterative. And so what I say today, and if it's there on YouTube 1 year later, I might just be like, I think I was completely wrong about approaching it this way, right? So I think that's how I've seen it. But I think one thing that stands fundamental to what and how I work is there are some, I guess, aspects, information I think that needs to be free. So when I put out, I guess, for example, a newsletter where it's just a curated newsletter for Earth observation, and I think that needs to exist. It exists for space, it exists for, I don't know, tech or software or biotech, and I hadn't found a lot in Earth observation, which is what prompted me to do it. So a lot of the fundamental aspects will be free, and I think it needs to be free. For example, when I do the market segmentation, of like there are 5 segments of VO, whether I'm right or not. And now it has gotten a lot of attention, and I think I've gotten validation about the segmentation since the last 3 years. But I think it will have to remain free because, and I'm very conscious about not letting the asymmetry of information crop up in our industry, where asymmetry of information is where you make decisions based on availability of information because you had the money to pay for something
Right.
versus another country or another investor or another company which didn't, which I find it to be very unfair. And I don't think it should work in our industry where it's such an early stage where, even positioning companies on the value chain, for me, that needs to be fundamental. And I want to see a lot more interest in it, right? Like that needs to be fundamental. So that's where I draw the line. Like, is this fundamental information? Is this something that a lot of people or most people who are interested in Earth observation need to know? And also, you'll reach a point where I think inevitably you need to dig deeper. You need to dig deeper into some areas, which is when it becomes consulting. It's like I'm trying to do my own consulting report. So when I find that it goes into an area where it's like almost specifying or answering to the needs of very specific users, I don't do that for free because I know that that is information
Yeah.
that is not. So, for example, the recent deep dive I did for the exclusive paid newsletter on Earth observation for climate risk. It's a very evolving area, and it would not have been justifiable for me to do all the work and give it away for free because it is very, very specific. Whereas Earth observation for climate, which is another deep dive I published recently, it's fundamental information. It's like there are so many applications of EO for climate. There are so many companies working on it in different ways, and that information needs to be public. So, that's kind of how I draw the line. And also, it's the same applies for podcasts. Like when I did the podcast, I'm just asking questions to people on how they think about the industry, what their company does, how they go about thinking about the trends in the industry and what their position is. I think that information should be free. And that's why, I did not even think about launching, let's say, a paid news podcast, if you will. There are some paid podcasts around the world, right? And so I think that's kind of my rationale. Does this information fundamental needs to be available? If it is, then I put it out for free.
So I understand that. I like this idea of like the information should be free. However, it's not it doesn't cost nothing to produce in the first place,
Of course.
be it in terms of time, in terms of the resources that it takes. It isn't for free. So it kind of becomes charity work, basically, if you
Mm-hmm.
approach it like this. So how do you justify that in the sense, like, just to make it stand the test of time as well? Like, if it's not sustainable, it's not going to keep going on.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe that the podcast actually is a good example. So if how do you balance those things? I mean, like, I think the newsletter and all the work that you do is incredibly valuable for a lot of people, and I think it being free and accessible to as wide of an audience as possible is something that I think we can all agree is great. But then, how do you make that financially sustainable?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things in the world that have this notion that like everybody should have that are governmentally funded usually,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like, okay, this doesn't need to make money, but we all agree this is something that we should do, so let's take a portion of the tax that everybody pays and fund it for that. I don't know, like school or hospitals or things like that. It depends where you live, but mostly that is how it goes. So how do you justify or think about the longevity of that work that you're doing that really is useful, but how do you make it sustainable?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a good question. It's a question that I've thought about a lot. And I've looked into a lot of case studies of, like, I'm not the first one to think about it, and you're not the first one to think about it. It's happened a lot. And I've read quite a lot in terms of how things work. And also, newsletters are kind of weird because, they are accessible, and you don't get paid because someone views it. It's not a YouTube. So the only way to monetize is you have an ad, which is what, web pages or newsletters, which is also a web page kind of work. So ad is kind of the only way, or you need to have a sponsor, which kind of affects my independence, right? Like, if, I don't know, organization X sponsors my newsletter and gives me money to produce it every year or every month, again, that takes away the independence. So that is in conflict with the monetization model, right? So, which is why I think, because the Earth observation is also not huge. I'm not talking about tech in general. My niche is like a niche within a niche. It's Earth observation, and guess what? I'll mostly focus on only satellite-based Earth observation, not other remote sensing areas, even though I tend to do that every now and then. But I've drawn my boundary so small that I have limited myself of, or taken myself off every monetization that is traditionally possible, having ads or things like that, because there's not going to be a big bunch of people. I think there will be interest because I'm seeing the newsletter grow in terms of people reading it and sharing it. So I can see that it is working, and EO will, at some point of time, become a lot more mainstream than what it is today. So that's kind of what my path is. But the way I think about monetization is essentially where the other two components come in, which is my consulting arm. And I view my newsletter, and I can say, I think with confidence, that at least, I guess, 75% of all consulting work that I've done have been extensions of what I started doing on the deep dives in the blog, right? Like, there are a lot of deep dives that I look into an area and I position companies, and that kind of works and creates what I call social currency. It doesn't generate financial currency, but it does social currency, and I think social currency is important when you're not a big brand. I don't work for, I don't want to name names, right? Like, but I don't want to say that they don't have anything, but then they have a brand. Like, if you see a report or even an article produced by organization X, you don't need to have the social currency because they've acquired that over years. But then for TerraWatch to acquire that, you need to do something almost as a requirement. If you don't do that, then and I think the paid newsletter is a good validation of that, because of the work I've done over the last, I guess, year and a half to 2 years in the newsletter. When I launched the paid newsletter, there were already some, immediate, I guess, upgrades, to put it simply. And I had not produced anything for them, but then, because of the social currency now has the potential to convert into financial currency. So the newsletter is one example, and the paid newsletter is one example, and the consulting is another example, right? So the social currency plays a big role into making it financial. And I think that's where the sustainability part comes in. Maybe, at some point in a year or two, I will have enough content to write and have enough people paying for it that the consulting arm can go away. Not that I want to go away, but I can see a point in my, let's say, my forecast where I can see, like, in a super optimistic scenario, there are so many people that pay enough. And again, there are a lot of creators who work like that. And I mean, it's again an experiment, because sometimes I feel like, a lot of information that I'm going to put on the deep dive is at some point also needs to be open, right? So maybe I have to open them up, right? I have to open the archives a few months after they were originally published with the permission of people who actually paid for my newsletter, because I cannot afford to continue giving away things only for exclusive people. And I think that will then, I guess, conflict with my principle in life that you should not have a lot of information that is just closed. And I think all of this came from my, I guess, experience being in the industry 2017 when I got in, and I tried to learn a lot of the resources which is closed. I try to read this report, it's closed. You need to pay money to get it, and I'm like, how is one supposed to really go and understand what's going on in this complex industry, which was crazy. And I can see now that a lot of decisions were made or being made because of this asymmetry of information, and I think that is not useful for anybody, if you know what I mean. Like, it's not going to make the industry grow. I think we need to have a lot of information. I think it kind of also is your open source argument from a lot of people on the technical side, that you need to have a lot of, I guess, frameworks and libraries open. And I think the same applies to, in general, strategic market information as well.
Right. So at the moment, it's basically the consultancy is what funds the newsletter, but the newsletter also brings in a lot of the consultancy.
Mhm.
So that like kind of creates this self-generating loop.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
see. That makes a lot of sense. So in that context, let's talk a little bit about the podcast.
Mhm.
So you've been running a podcast. I think you started like a month before I did.
Oh, yeah. Nice. Yeah.
So
COVID times, we had a.
exactly, yeah. These things came up pretty much at the same time, and you've decided to put yours aside, at least momentarily for now. I'd love to kind of, following up on the conversation we just had about the wanting to put things out in the world, but these things also costing time and money. What was a little bit the decision process and the value proposition that you put together to ultimately decide that, at least for now, you're going to put it aside?
Yeah, I mean, it was not an easy decision, because obviously the podcast was growing with every episode, and also from a, not just from an audience listening and hearing their feedback perspective, but also from people who want to be on the podcast, right? Like, people contacted to ask to be featured on the podcast, to have discussions, because I guess, as you know, as we've been saying quite a lot, this isn't happening enough, which helps explain why there are, like, people want to listen. There are, like, probably handful of resources to go read or listen in our industry. So it was not surprising, right? Like, so it was not that, and I always say, it's not that it was the, I don't know, the best resource, or I was the, I don't know, I was a thought leader or whatever. It's just that there are not enough people who are expressing thoughts, or there are not enough discussions being had. So whatever you produce and put out will be good, whether it's analysis, whether it is discussions, whether it's podcast episodes, it's going to be good. I mean, obviously, it takes a lot of time and work. It's not just inviting people on and chatting. You need to have a flow and prepare and all that. But inevitably, I think because of the lack of this content, having some content already works. So I think it was great to have that, and keep reinforcing the message, and I guess the motivation when people contacted and said they listened and it was insightful for them, etc. So I think that's what kept me going. And when I started getting a lot of work, and the newsletter started to grow, and I launched the paid newsletter. Started working on a bunch of projects, and I also have ideas for a couple of others that are in the pipeline that I need to work on. That I'm working on right now as we speak. The course and the conference, which I can talk about if you want. So I needed to prioritize, and I had to kind of look into what is the value that I'm getting and what is the value that others are getting. And I think even for recording an episode of the podcast, if I did not find value, and usually I look for ticking both boxes. Am I enjoying it? Am I getting value out of this conversation? And two, equally, will people get value and enjoy the conversation? If it didn't tick both boxes, then I would not do it, because I think it was necessary for me to enjoy what I was doing, because there are probably a couple of episodes that I did that was only audience based. It's like, okay, audience will enjoy this, so I have to do it, even though it's like very basic stuff. Let's say, I have to do it. But those episodes, I found myself to be a bit bored. So, to give an example of it didn't tick both boxes, and no wonder that episode didn't do well, so because you're not fully in on it. And I think the decision of the podcast was also exactly that. It's like, am I going to stop giving value to the community? The answer is no, because there's the newsletter and there's going to be more deep dives, more time, and also the two new projects, the course and the conference. So the value is not going to go away. Am I going to enjoy myself less? Obviously not. And I think that was the first. And the second thing was, I could not find the link that you mentioned between the newsletter and the consulting and, let's say, the monetization, the financial sustainability. I could not figure that out for the podcast. It was kind of
interesting.
It was kind of a hard, and obviously, I didn't go into YouTube because it extended the time that I had to spend on working on the podcast. So I didn't put it on YouTube, which I think is a good monetization model. But being just a podcast, so the second decision was more related to monetization. And I guess I tried a couple of things, and people again wanted to sponsor an episode, meaning they wanted to pay for an episode and come on the podcast, which happened a few times, especially with people who I wanted to have on the podcast anyway, and they wanted to come and talk about something that they just launched or they are working on. So, I was like, yeah, it makes sense. That's a monetization model. But then I could not find any repeatability in that. I could not find it's almost like it was very sporadic. It was like, okay, it happened once in January and then nothing until March. And then suddenly you get a message like, I'm ready to do that. So I could not find it. And I also tried other ways that we have spoken about, of having, a kind of a long-term sponsor a series of episodes. Let's say an organization wants to talk about, I don't know, what's the use of EO in industry X, and go through all the applications and talk to a lot of experts, but then they are willing to sponsor it. I could not find anything, or I could not make that happen. I think there's value in it, and I think there's potential in it. Maybe it was too early, and people didn't realize the value of having good content. I'm sure they'll come around, because maybe you'll find that. I know that Daniel already found that with Mapscaping, with I think one sponsor. I forgot who the sponsor was. So I think other podcasters have a way to do that, and I think it goes back to monetization. Goes back to the niche inside a niche. I think if you're starting a random tech podcast, you won't have a problem, because I can find a random, organic toothpaste ad that I can put on my podcast. But I don't want to do that, right? Like I am not interested in doing that. And this is a podcast specifically for EO. And we are not in a very ad-based business. And I think I'm of the opinion that we are not like, you advertise an organization and people are going to be like, I remember the name, right? Like, I'm going to go and buy a product from that. We're not like that, because a lot of people listening have no clue how this technology works. So we need a lot more educational content as opposed to ads. So ads was not a monetization model. So yeah, so I couldn't find any monetization. And, at the end of the day, you need to kind of, I guess, prioritize as well, because there's, I guess, free time, or in my consulting terms, non-billable hours that are being used for the newsletter, that are also being used for the podcast. And I think I need to prioritize, and eventually I decided, and I also knew that what I was doing was going to probably not compensate, but at least continue giving value. So it's not like I'm running away and doing nothing, and just chilling, which I would not have liked to do. But the newsletter continues to go on. There are more deep dives coming up. There's a course that's going to come up, right? And yeah, so I think the value is still going to be there.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about the course and the conference. What's the reasoning behind that?
Mm-hmm.
And what are you trying to achieve with those?
Yeah, I think the course is a function of, again, I think a lot of TerraWatch has been, I guess, offerings of TerraWatch, or what I started doing was based on what people got back to me with. And I think the course was also an example of, I think the paid newsletter was suggested by a few people, and that's why I launched it.
Hmm.
And somehow then started working. The course is, again, an example of that, where I had a few people reach out to ask if there's like a consolidation of everything related to Earth observation that they can go and learn. There were three different categories, and that's why my course is aimed at three different categories. So it's a course that is going to be commercially focused, so Earth observation business focused course, that is aimed at three different categories. So the professionals working in Earth observation, who are there and who've been there for years, or maybe they are new, whatever it is, they're already working in Earth observation. They would appreciate having a view of where the market is, where it's going, what are the business models, what are the types of companies, etc. The second category is people who want to get in. It can be for entrepreneurial reasons. They want to start a company that uses satellite data and they want to understand the whole ecosystem. So that's the second category. The second category can also be someone who wants to join an Earth observation company in a marketing
Right.
role, but they want to know what EO is about. And the third category is end users. So everyone that I'm working with and everyone that will use satellite imagery in the future, them as well, who want to be who expressed interest, and the course is also aimed at them. So that's the point of the course. The idea is to be a live cohort course, at least in the beginning. I did not want to shoot videos because, as you know, Earth observation is such a rapidly moving, evolving industry
Yeah.
that the signs you can record videos about, but then if you're doing video like course about EO business, I think what I'm going to produce will be obsolete in 6 months, because there's a new model. So I wanted to first run a live core course where people can come and get to see a presentation, hear from guest speakers that I will have from the Earth observation industry, and then be ready, really. So be Earth observation ready, whether it's starting a company, joining a company, or starting to use Earth observation. That's really the point. And then obviously they can go and deep dive, right? Like maybe there's someone who wants to learn more about, I don't know, how SAR works, and then I'll go ask them to go and, I guess, follow Joe on Twitter, or follow Yen on Twitter, or go read the book, right? So they will want to do deep dives, and I think that'll be a success point for me if they want to go and dig deeper into it. But that's not what I want to do. I don't want to teach them how fundamentals of remote sensing work, because there are a lot of free resources for that. I think people want to know the so what and for what, and how, and things like that. That's kind of what the course is going to focus on.
You mentioned things change a lot over in the industry on the commercial side. What are you keeping your eyes on at the moment? What are some of the changes that you're seeing right now happen in the industry, or over the course of the next few months? These conversations, I try to make them in a timeless manner, but I
Mm-hmm.
find like it's always interesting to be able to go back later on
Mm-hmm.
at
To
some of the
call me
predictions
out,
that
yeah.
that were made. No, that's
No, I'm
not. I
joking. Yeah,
wouldn't put
that's
it like
fine.
this. It's just it's an interesting learning
No, no, of course, yeah.
opportunity to look back without hindsight, because
Of
in
course,
6 months
yeah.
we'll have hindsight. So that's why I'm asking now. I'm quite curious. What are you thinking about at the moment? What are you keeping your eye on and maybe excited about?
Yeah, I think I'll probably split that into two, right? Like one on the, let's say, the Earth observation side, and the other on the end user side. The On the Earth observation side, obviously technologically a lot of things are changing. I think I already spoke about edge compute and onboard processing. I'm curious to see the positioning of edge compute in the industry, and what it's actually going to bring, and whose problems it's actually going to solve, because it's an interesting technology, especially if you combine edge compute with laser comms, or you combine edge compute with intersatellite links.
Let me interrupt you there. Can you
Mhm.
define what edge compute is?
Yeah. So essentially, I think we discussed that a little bit previously about onboard
Hmm.
processing. So having the processing happen, processing, again, if you look at it as a spectrum, maybe a little bit of pre-processing, maybe a little bit of, I don't know, cloud detection, or even going further and saying, I'm going to use the data that I just acquired to just apply an algorithm of, I don't know, building detection, and just detect the building, and then instead of sending the pixels or the image back, you just send the image where the buildings are all marked or labeled, right? So that's just one example of how edge compute would work.
So doing that on the satellite
On the
rather than
satellite, yeah.
downlinking all the images.
Exactly,
So
yeah.
why this is something that I have a hard time understanding what the main value of is. And so what are you seeing in that?
Yeah, I think the second trend I was going to mention that is what was going to kind of impact edge computing. So, imagine you have edge computing, which I've already explained, and I'll come to the value in a bit. And the second kind of interesting technology that's coming up is inter-satellite links, where, satellites are connected, meaning you can transmit information between them, or you can kind of have satellites talk to themselves, to put it simply. And edge computing in combination with that is probably what is going to be impactful for the second use case, where it's all about fusion. We know that data fusion, a lot of type of sensors, a lot of types of data sets from different providers talking to each other is what is going to make a good solution. But if we can abstract some aspects of it away, by that I mean, instead of getting, let's say, an image with a methane plume and try and figure out where the factory is around it, all of which you can find out with satellite data. For the first, you probably need a hyperspectral instrument to detect greenhouse gas and try and quantify it. You need hyperspectral. But for you to understand where the building is, and for high resolution data set, to understand where the building is, where the factory is, for instance, you need optical data set. But the status quo is you need to downlink the hyperspectral, you need to detect the emission, and then you need to go and task the next satellite to go and take a picture of where the emission may have come from so that you can detect the source, right? So one example. So for me, the edge compute is useful because you can now do a lot of this. You can abstract away, let's say, the first step onto orbit. Maybe you can do the second step on the ground. So the first step is where you have the satellites detect the emission and have the onboard algorithm to detect the methane, which can then, if a level of methane is detected, which is, bad enough from an environmental point of view, then task or send the command to the optical satellite right away to take an image of, so that it's also useful for validation. Because if you take the image, I don't know, 1 hour later, in the status quo scenario where you have downlinked the image, found out the emission, and then
I
you
see.
task, you've already missed out, because methane also, for example, methane kind of flows very quickly. So the timeliness of the data is very useful. So all of this comes back to timeliness, right? So timeliness in this case is useful, and you can now use the linked satellites and onboard computing to make sure that you have a picture then you need it. It's not 1 hour
I
later.
see.
You can still task the satellite 1 hour later, or you can automate it. But if you have the ability to do it synchronously for a use case, I think it's going to be very interesting. But those use cases are not far. They're not a lot. They're going to be far and in between. But I see that there's going to be some where we will see the value. And what I will say is, what I'm saying is my representation. We need to build this use case together with the end user. I think that is the most important thing, because we cannot assume that is going to be useful. But if we manage to tell the end user this capability is available, maybe they will define what they can do with the technology instead of us. Today I'm not going to go and create a startup that will do what I said, because that would be wrong, because I have not validated it. Nobody has said that they will pay premium for this.
I
Nobody
see.
said they will even pay for it. But once we do that, and that's what excites me about the future, is we have some technologies that I think we have it available. Like you said, you haven't found the point of it. But then maybe we haven't found the point of it because we haven't interacted enough and explained this to the people who might actually make use of it, right? Like the insurance companies, do you really need data available in 5 minutes? Because that's what edge compute promises, right? Like you can get the data down, like analytics down in 10 minutes. What we need to do more is, and that's where what I'm excited about the end user side of things is, them involving in our process, right? Like they discover this edge computing is available and they tell us that in 10 minutes, I can make use of it and I'm ready to pay premium, because that's going to give me a good estimate of the flood,
Right.
flow or where the damage is, for them to make damage assessments or claims processing, whatever it is. Or they say, you know what, I'm better off waiting half an hour and sending someone, because the confidence of that is 100%, because that person has either went there and validated it himself, whereas the edge computing has a lot of like uncertainties, right? Like it's probably going to work only 70%, and they will decide if they're going to be willing to pay premium for 70%, or are they just happy to send someone and get 100% confidence that this is the level of the flood. It was not this
I
flood.
see.
You know what I mean? So
the main value that you see in edge compute is just is to be able to get a first image rather than sending it down, doing the processing, and then sending the command back up for another satellite to task, is to be able to just cut the middleman down on Earth and all of that staying in orbit, which is a lot faster. I think that the main thing that we didn't mention as well is that you have a certain latency that you need to wait before an image can get downlinked. The way I usually talk about this is like if you were in a car on the highway and you don't have data and you want to send a message to someone, you can only do that. This is where the analogy starts breaking down. Like if you drive by a gas station that has a Wi-Fi spot, and you can like connect to the Wi-Fi on the car for like 2 minutes, and then your car just moved too far away, and you have that 2 minute to send your text, and then for the next hour and a half, for the next 90 minutes, you can't send something down. Mm-hmm. And so you have to wait, even if you have your text message or your image that's ready, you have to wait until you pass by that gas station to be able to send it. And so it's cutting that down because right now, as of today, we don't have a faster communication with the satellites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but then, that's not the only solution, right? Like you have, like I mentioned, satellite links, you have laser comms.
Yeah, I see.
You have, you're also talking about, I guess, storage in space and computing in space, storage and computing in space. So where you send that to, let's say, a geostationary satellite, which is always staring at a ground station. And that's what, for example, Airbus uses. And I think NASA also has that. So, that technology already exists. So I wouldn't push the latency too much. I think the three most important things for me for edge computing is obviously what you mentioned, the reduction of the latency. And the two is the ability to, I guess, connect to or enable fusion happen on orbit as opposed to happening that happening on the ground. And the third thing is doing repeatable things, or let's say abstracting away the repeatable things. Let's say you're taking an image and you're taking the same image of the same parcel for all your acquisitions. You're better off labeling it probably on orbit because you have a good enough algorithm that can just run on orbit and you get the image down so that you don't have to pay a lot of money for storage and even for compute, because all of that can be done on orbit, and you just get, because it's the same parcel you're going to take a picture of every time, and there are only very small, I guess, conditions or changes that's going to happen in our area. So repeatability also can be a good, I guess, requirement for edge computing. So edge computing is, again, very fascinating, and like I said, we need to involve. And for example, the fusion element that I talked to you about, it came from an end user, because they were the ones who were pushing us, who were in a workshop, to ask, why can we not do that? Why do I need to wait an hour to task the satellite to source or to find the source of the emission? And I was just fascinated because I was just wondering, is that possible today? I don't know why that's not possible. It should be possible. But then nobody has built it because nobody talked to them to figure out if they would be willing to pay for it, right? So I think a lot of the use cases will come alive. And I think some of them will probably come alive inevitably because defense is going to adopt that, sooner or later, like everything in Earth observation. But I think the commercial sector is also going to define a lot of the future of edge compute.
So it seems like it's more about putting the people in contact together and back to trying to do that communication layer between what people could actually use and what is capable and what we need to build next. Doing that education, I think, is something that you've mentioned multiple times.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think we need to make that like happen in a very, like I mentioned, independent, objective way. So where they're
Yeah,
participating, but then we should also not make the mistake of waiting too much for them to say that. I think we can
fair.
afford to have assumption, of course. Like I think, was it Steve Jobs who said, or was it Ford? I forget who said that. Like you can't ask people for if they want a car because they'll just want a faster horse. And I think Steve Jobs had the same thing for the iPhone or iPod. I don't remember. So we can't afford to make that mistake too much, but we've been in an industry where we have done the other extreme a lot, where we have assumed this is what people want. Let's put this in orbit. Let's develop this. And we've already done that extreme a lot. So we can afford to kind of be somewhere in the middle where we can almost co-develop with end users. And for them to be in a position to co-develop, they need to understand the fundamentals. They need to understand who are the players. What is the way status quo today? Maybe status quo is good enough. Like I said, maybe edge compute is absolutely not needed at all. But we can't say that. Is my final point on that.
One of the things that I like starting to wrap up a little bit is I'm curious like where you yourself keep up with a lot of the things going on, because I for me like you're one of the aggregators in this industry of like if I want to get 80% of what's going on with even like 5% of the effort, your newsletter is a great resource for that. But there's a lot of things going on that are a lot of different places between what the latest agency like NASA or ESA has been up to what a new startup just came out of stealth, to this big merger is going on, to an open source project came out. Like these are very different places where you might find these resources. And I know just from doing the research for these podcasts, it takes an enormous amount of time. I'm curious, like, what are some resources that you find, or how do you manage to do all of that?
Yeah, I think it's a function of social media and being open to, I guess, different industries and learning about the different industries. Because on the end user side of things, that's how I get my learnings and even discover companies there. Is I'm interested in a few end user sectors. I try and be as horizontal as possible, but then obviously there are more things happening in insurance and agriculture, more so than, for example, mining or I don't know, another industry. But there are some resources there, industry specific, that I follow, for instance, to understand like which of those companies are looking at using Earth observation, or maybe there are companies that we have not heard of that have raised. I know that there are companies that have raised 300 million that we probably don't talk about, but then the core technology to their platform or their product is satellite data, and obviously we don't include them in Earth observation, but you can find them only if you're in their world. So I try and follow that in terms of newsletters and just connecting with the right people or finding them, I suppose. So that's one. And two is, like I mentioned, social media. I think as a function of Earth observation and being, I don't know, the one of the few who looks at the market, inevitably I attract the kind of crowd, whether it's in the form of a LinkedIn connection or them sending a message or just catching up. And I discover a lot of that, and they point me to, I guess, different things that are happening in their world, which I think helps a lot. And also when I follow them on LinkedIn and Twitter, they post things that are relevant to their industry, and more often than not there's a lot of relevance for our industry. It can be in the form of me using satellite data to develop this product, which is very straightforward. But then maybe there is let's say a software company. I used to work in software before, so software is still something that or let's say software driven companies is an industry that I still follow a lot. So following an investor who's working there, investing in software companies, when he's talking about how companies scale up in software, there's a lot of things that we can learn from that and apply it to our world, because at the end of the day, we are building software products and we are asking people to do subscriptions. So essentially, a lot of what they are saying applies to us as well. So I think it's just about going outside and thinking about from a application point of view and following those people and getting information from them, talking with them, and then looking at parallels. I like looking at different parallels and analogies to our industry and seeing And that's what kind of started my interest in weather. And now I consider weather to be part of Earth observation, whether people like that or not. Because for me, I could not find a difference, even in the way the value chain is segmented, how processing happens. And I know that in the satellite imagery world does not really interact a lot with the weather world, but then there's a lot of best practices that the weather world has done, right? Like standardization. Data sets are shared around the world today when data is collected in a format, in a method that the whole world has agreed upon. For me, I find that fascinating. And here we are talking about, can we standardize our tasking APIs? For me, that seems like such a small problem to solve. It's like, of course, we should solve that. We are sharing weather data on a global level on formats and methodologies that we have agreed upon, right? Like, so of course we can stand that. So there's a lot of best practices that we can take from there. So I think just keeping, I guess, myself and my options open. And because you're working in such a horizontal technology space, everything is open, right? Like if I want to go and find out about, like I mentioned, mining, I would never do that if I was not working in this industry, but it forces me to go and look into a mining company. Or how does parametric insurance work? You don't think about it in Earth observation, but then because Earth observation has value there, I think I force myself and also just be attracted to that as well, because I'm curious. People are raising hundreds of millions of dollars because Earth observation is useful for that industry. And I'm like curious, is that really what is the status quo? How are they solving that problem? Because we are selling it almost as if they are not solving it for themselves, which I find hard to believe, right? Like if it's such a big problem, how have they not found any solutions? And then when you dig deeper, you find that, and then you learn about the industry and they're actually solving the problem, right? Like you don't need only satellites to do flood maps. You can have sensors on ground, and there are a lot of people who do that, and that's how they roll. They don't need satellite data. I mean, they could use it, but then exposing myself to that, I guess, made me appreciate the value of satellite data and the relevance, and also in some cases the non-relevance as well. So that's kind of, I think, keeping myself open to, I guess, all the applications of Earth observation is what I'll say.
So it sounds to me like it's mostly following specific individuals
Individuals, but
that you
also
find.
sectors and sector newsletters and sector trends. And I
Right.
went to the extreme and I attended a few, I guess, non-EO conferences, which I
I see.
think was found to be too indulging too much. I don't think that level of indulgence is required, but I think some level of understanding in what's going on in the industry is important to understand, especially in my position, right? Like, because I'm trying to understand and tell investors and space agencies and end users where the industry is going. And I cannot lead them towards a path that is wrong, or I cannot make myself
Yeah.
think of
Yeah.
something that is just not right.
I usually wrap up asking for a book and a podcast recommendation. Usually I ask people like about anything. I'd like to ask here if there's any that you found useful in your own research, like resources, like a book. And I don't know if podcast is going to fit quite as much, but I'm still going to ask if there's anything that you found particularly interesting in trying to understand the industry a little bit better.
You mean Earth observation in general?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, for Earth observation, I don't think I have found many that actually have given. I think there have been books from a technical perspective, obviously, that I have not read completely, but then I've almost used them as references, right? There's a remote sensing fundamentals book. I can send you the link. I forgot the names and the authors, but it's a textbook, right? Like it's a textbook
Right.
of how
Yeah.
remote sensing works, that I use for as references. But I think because the industry is so fast evolving and moving, I don't know if it's easy to summarize that as a book right now. I think we can start doing that. A couple of people have asked me for writing a book, and I've not been very keen on that, just because I want to kind of reach a point of understanding of, I guess, stability of the industry a little bit at least, because it's still very early stages, especially commercially speaking. So the answer is no. I don't think I have found any book. There are obviously SAR books. There are, again, like I said, there are textbooks. They are not
I see.
reference books for understanding the industry. But I think what I'll say is, as I mentioned, it's no different from software. So any book that talks about the fundamentals of, there's a book on how to do good sales. There is a book called To Sell is Human, which is an interesting book because it just talks about how to be a good salesman and how to, evangelize better, and how to talk about the use of what you're selling better so that you can reach the end user. And I think the industry can use that, right? Like, we are today in a position where we're not in a position to sell at all. We are always in a position of problem solving. We are customizing. We are not selling. We have not tried to sell, because for selling, you also need to have a very, I guess, evangelizing outlook, like I said, for people to understand the benefits of the technology. So, that books come to mind, To Sell is Human. There's also, obviously there are aspects about climate that I will link to, and obviously the Weather Machine is a good book about weather if people are interested in weather. But I think, from a climate perspective, there was a book that was called the Climate book by Greta Thunberg, which talks into how the climate works, and how basically the whole, how climate change happens, what is climate change. And you can start appreciating from a big picture point of view where satellites play a role. And it's the same case with Bill Gates' book. He also wrote a book on climate. And reading those books is fascinating for me because you can start seeing where satellite data can play a role, and start imagining use cases and applications. And that's what I started doing in the last year or so, a lot more, to improve my understanding, because I can only speak to so many end users. I can only speak to so many companies. But then if I read these very, I guess, horizontal books that are very multi-vertical, I can start understanding a lot more about the role of Earth observation. And I think if people are interested in Earth observation, they should not read, I would recommend not read only Earth observation books, because we would be only stuck in our own bubble. I think we should read outside to see what problems there are to solve, whether it's in climate, whether it's in energy transition or agriculture. And there's a book that I'm, will start to read soon. It's called Regenesis. I think it's about agriculture and regenerative agriculture, and the point of how we need to change our food system. And again, you have a lot of role that satellite data will have to play in that, and we can start linking those. And I think that's what I'll try and say, because it's hard to say there's one book for Earth observation. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know if I haven't found any.
No, that sounds pretty good. Any luck on the podcast side? Anything you found useful?
Yeah, well, I think I try and listen to non-Earth observation podcasts for the same reason I said about before, about trying to keep myself open, trying to learn from other industries and learn from other, I guess, other technologies as well. Because one of the technologies that, if or not technologies, but then one of the industries that I'm very, very interested in is software, because that's where my background is, and I appreciate a lot of the way software industry has worked. And you have, podcasts. There are, I guess, tons of podcasts. Sometimes I listen to the Tim Ferriss show, and he has someone who's invested in software for 20 years, and you start appreciating how scalability works in software. And then I try and then apply that to, for example, in Earth observation. When I'm doing a due diligence for a company, I include that straight away, because it made so much sense that we need to have a growth potential which is in this level. If not, the investor is never going to get his money back, because EO has not reached that, right? So it was an immediate kind of adaptation of something that I heard from software. So I guess any software related and product related podcasts. I listen to a lot of. I think it's called Lenny's podcast. It's someone who writes a newsletter on products and how to build good products. I don't know if that's the name of his podcast, but then his newsletter is called Lenny's newsletter, and he talks about just product building. How do you build good products? It can be any sort of products in the world. It can be a product to provide ads, or it can be a product like Slack. It can be a product like Zoom. But how to just build good products, right? So for me, those kind of podcasts are very interesting. That's probably one that is relevant for this industry or for your audience, because we have to learn to build good products. We are very, very, and it goes back to what I said before. We know that we are going to produce very, very useful applications. It's like, it's a no-brainer. But how can we make that usable? Is something that fascinates me a lot, especially from companies that have managed to do that over the last 20 years in the digital world. How have they managed to build good products? how did Twitter become, well, X now, or Facebook become so ubiquitous that every page you see, you have an API link to Facebook or Twitter, and you just click one link and you can go and tweet it. You know what I mean? So for me, the usability of Twitter just improved vastly. If you have to kind of do a parallel for Earth observation, we can build a product that can essentially go, and weather app is a very good example of how we have tried to make that a product now. People don't care about what's in the background, things in the foreground. That's what matters to them. And yeah, so weather app is something that we've already done, and I've started to see Earth observation become that slowly. There's an organization in the US that now links up with a company that sells properties in the US, and people can now have access to what is the flood risk for the property that I'm going to buy, what is the wind risk, what is the fire risk that I'm going to buy. That's a product, and we need to start producing more products like that, because that is a product that will be accessed by B2C. It's going to be accessed by millions of people who are going to see, before they buy a house, is their house susceptible to sea level rise, to flood, to wildfires? And we know that our technology has a role to play. But have we done enough to reach them? I don't think so. So that's where I think the importance of building good products comes in.
I will put show notes to most of these if I can manage to find all of them. But these are great resources.
Yeah, it's very unconventional. Nothing about EO, nothing about
No, but that's
human
great.
tech.
I think that's useful to know a little bit, like what are you keeping an eye on. Of course, I'll put links to TerraWatch Space, the newsletter. You're also a lot on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'll put both of those. And yeah, thanks so much for coming on again. This was great, and I'm sure we'll do this again next time.
Yeah, thanks, Max. Thanks for having me on. It's been fun watching our podcast grow, and listening to the episodes and the way you ask questions. I think it's much needed in the industry, and I am guessing that the growth is not going to stop, because the industry, like I was saying before, needs a lot more of this. And if you're one of the few who's doing it, I think growth is almost guaranteed, because it's a useful technology. It's going to have a lot of impact. And guess what? There's not enough supply. So you might be surprised to see how much it's growing, because I see that with the newsletter in terms of how the interest is growing for Earth observation for different industries and different applications. And I think it's going to be the same for you. So yeah, keep it up.
Yeah, let's do this again in 2 years then.
Yep.
Let's make this a recurring thing.
Yeah, 100%.